This is undoubtedly one of the top questions I hear from nonprofit founders. How do I actually turn this nonprofit into my full-time job? You've built something meaningful. You believe in the mission. Maybe you're currently putting in a ton of unpaid hours and it's just not sustainable for you to keep doing that forever. So it needs to become your job. Well, speaking from personal experience, I know that the path from volunteer founder to paid executive director can feel really unclear and intimidating. I've not only gone from founder to full-time nonprofit executive director for the organization that I founded, but I've also helped advise hundreds of others on how to make this transition too. So by the end of this video, you'll have a checklist of what you and your organization need to have ready in 4 key areas before you can realistically step into a full-time executive director role. And I'm not gonna lie, it's not easy, but it is absolutely possible with the right foundations in place. So let's discuss. Now, as I just mentioned, there are things that you and your organization need to do or have in place in 4 main categories before you can sustainably work as the full-time executive director for the nonprofit that you started. Those categories are financial and fundraising readiness, board governance readiness, operational readiness, and personal readiness also. So let's talk through each one and what they include. Now, before you can hire an executive director or any staff for that matter, your nonprofit needs to have some solid understanding of its costs, finances, and fundraising strategy. First, you and your board really need to know what it will actually cost for an executive director salary. Now, a lot of founders and boards miss this part because they just think about the salary amount itself as the full cost, but there are actually additional costs to account for when hiring any staff. This is the estimated total cost of employment, and that includes payroll taxes, employer side Social Security and Medicare, workers' compensation insurance, and benefits like potential health insurance contributions, retirement contributions, and paid time off accrual. Now, if you've never done a payroll before, it's important to know that those additional costs can easily add up to 10 to 20% on top of the salary. So if the executive director base salary is $60,000, then you have to actually estimate around $72,000 when accounting for the buffer for those employment costs. And as for what the salary should be itself, you need to do some deep research on fair and competitive compensation for executive directors in your local region. To do this, you might look at resources like Candid, formerly GuideStar, nonprofit compensation reports that they've got over there. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has some data, local nonprofit job postings, and state nonprofit association salary surveys, or even sites like Indeed or payscale.com. Secondly, ideally, your organization would have at least 6 to 12 months of an executive director's salary secured before you transition full-time. And this is important because you need a runway to get going. Setting up infrastructure, systems, and growing funding does not happen overnight. It takes months and months, which you probably already know in this nonprofit work. That means that if, for example, your fully loaded executive director annual compensation is $80,000, having $40,000 to $80,000 committed or raised before transitioning gives you breathing room to build systems without having to feel like you're panicking every month. Third, and this is huge, you need to have a solid, tested fundraising strategy that does not depend on one major funding source. If 90% of your revenue comes from one grant or one donor, that's just not stable. I've seen grants and contracts and donations canceled on a dime, and you don't want that to have the rug pulled out from under you when you're trying to get started. So part of having a solid, tested fundraising strategy is having a clear understanding of what your organization's fundraising cycle looks like. Ideally, you'll have been raising money for your organization for at least a full year, so you can understand what your cash flow and when funding and donations spike or slow down is. Now, this is going to be important for knowing how to plan out your fundraising after you become the full-time executive director also. Fourth, and finally, in the finance and fundraising category, this is the part that people, I think, don't talk about enough. You personally need to feel confident that you can raise at least 2 to 3 times your own salary in the coming year. because as executive director, you're not just responsible for raising your own salary, you need to raise enough to also cover programs plus operations. Of course, that doesn't mean you're supposed to do it alone. A healthy, effective board really is supposed to support fundraising, but it is also true that in most small or startup nonprofits, the executive director is leading the fundraising efforts. Now, fundraising is just one piece of this puzzle. The next is making sure your board of directors is ready to have you as its full-time executive director on staff. Now, this is where I've seen founder transitions get complicated. A lot of aspiring founders don't realize this legal aspect of starting and growing a nonprofit, and that is, as founder, you cannot hire yourself or vote to hire yourself. That's a conflict of interest. So your board must vote to hire you. They also determine your salary and create and approve your employment contract, and that requires a mature, informed board. First, your board needs to understand that you have a personal goal of becoming the full-time executive director so that they can be a collaborator and supporter with you to work towards that goal. Second, they need to understand the research around appropriate compensation benchmarks. Sharing any research that you've done with them or asking them to research it themselves is key so that you have a mutual understanding about what's fair and competitive in your landscape. As a founder, please don't be a martyr like I was in the beginning. You need to advocate for yourself, and you have every right to make enough to survive and pay your bills. This role has to be sustainable for you, for the health of the mission and the organization, and of course, you too. Third, your board needs to be super clear about their fiduciary and legal duties, especially as it relates to collaborating with and providing oversight for an executive director position. That means understanding how their role as board members will need to evolve from being in the weeds of operations to letting go of those responsibilities to the executive director. Their role, once they hire an executive director, becomes supporting that person, focusing on long-term strategy, policy, and governance, and helping with fundraising. Fourth, you need a clear, written executive director job description that says more than just this person runs everything. What will you actually be responsible for? Is it going to be fundraising targets, staff management, program oversight, all of the above and more? This job description will in turn inform the creation of an employment contract, which your organization needs to protect both itself and you. Your board should be creating an employment contract that outlines salary and any benefits like time off, health insurance, etc. Expectations and evaluation process. How will they evaluate your performance? It's really healthy to have an annual performance review, for example. Reporting structure, what metrics are tracked and how. And your bylaws should clarify whether the executive director will become an ex officio board member, meaning you'll serve by virtue of your role, and whether you have voting rights. This clarity protects you and can mitigate issues that could come up later. So I want to talk about operational readiness next. And by that, I mean your organization already has some processes and structures in place that make it ready for a full-time staff person. So one aspect of this that you might not expect is having your programs that are not only up and running, but already showing some results. Part of this is because an executive director should be coming in at a point in the organization where it's ready to deepen or expand its impacts. Funders rarely support organizations without any evidence that their programs are working first, even on a small scale. So having programs that are at least showing some results is connected to your ability to do all that fundraising that we talked about in the first category. Now, clarifying something, your programs don't have to be huge at this point. Obviously, that takes some more financial investment. It's a chicken and egg scenario. But you do need evidence that the program's work is real and trackable. For example, if you run a mentoring nonprofit, you should already be tracking how many matches you've created, how often they meet, and early indicators of impact before you have the established credibility to warrant hiring a full-time executive director. Secondly, before you or anyone becomes a paid employee, your organization must be legally and structurally prepared to employ someone. So that includes things like payroll processing systems and processes, bookkeeping systems, workers' compensation insurance, we talked about that before, general liability insurance, directors and officers insurance, and basic HR policies, including time off and workplace expectations. And if those systems don't exist, your first months as a paid executive director are going to feel very chaotic. And third, you need fundraising systems in place, like a fundraising platform that collects and manages your organization's donations to make sure that you have the operational infrastructure in place to hit the ground running with fundraising. Now we'll talk about the fourth area, the one that I think is enormously underestimated, in just a moment. But first, let's take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Click and Pledge. Starting and growing a nonprofit can feel super overwhelming, but Click and Pledge makes it easy for nonprofits to start strong and scale with confidence. With Click and Pledge, you're going to get professional grade tools for super affordable startup level costs from day one. They've got customizable donation forms that you can brand and plug right into your website to start creating the foundation of your online fundraising strategy. But Click and Pledge also has a number of other tools too, included in their affordable flat monthly costs. And you can use them as your nonprofit grows. Things like in-person and peer-to-peer fundraising features, video fundraising with embedded donation links right in the videos, text-to-give tools, donor management and custom reports, Salesforce and other integrations, all included with no contracts or surprise add-on fees. Now, unlike some platforms that increase your fees as you grow, Click and Pledge pricing stays the same whether you have 10 donors or 10,000. So you can use the QR code in the link in the description below to check out Click and Pledge, book a demo, and get your first $25 monthly fee waived. Okay, you do not want to skip this fourth category, personal readiness, because this is the part people don't talk about much, but is actually one of the most critical pieces to making all this work. Here's the thing, speaking from personal experience, going from founder to paid executive director really requires a big mental shift. When I made that transition, I had to get used to collaborating with my board of directors differently, and I had to learn new skills that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't just leading volunteers anymore. I was accountable to a governing body that had the authority to evaluate and technically even fire me. That's healthy governance. The IRS wants your board to provide accountability to you and the organization as part of allowing your nonprofit to have its tax-exempt status. But it does require some humility. You need to ask yourself, are you ready to move from I built this to I am accountable to this? Are you ready to manage staff, to delegate, to let go of tasks that you love doing? And also, are you financially prepared if you start part-time or at a lower salary initially? Do you have savings? Is your partner or spouse aligned with your plan? The most important thing you can do, in my opinion, in addition to the self-reflection, is be willing to learn and grow and adapt. This work can be incredibly rewarding, but it does require regular growth and some agility. Becoming your nonprofit's full-time executive director isn't just about payroll, it's about crossing a maturity milestone. And it often marks a turning point for an organization because when organizations successfully pass this stage, when they hire a full-time leader with runway and board alignment and operational systems and personal readiness, their impact expands significantly because someone is finally able to focus full-time on strategy, fundraising, partnerships, and growth. So if you're in that in-between space right now, you're still volunteering, you're still building, you're still dreaming about making this sustainable, I really hope that this has helped you think through the next steps. I recommend taking some time to evaluate your organization honestly in those 4 areas: finances, board governance, operations, and personal readiness, and write down where you're strong and where you still need to build. And if you want support and extra guidance, I share weekly tips and resources for nonprofit leaders and changemakers in my free newsletter. I'll leave the link to that below, and it's always on my website, changemakercafe.com. In the next video, we're going to talk about some special techniques for increasing donations at your fundraising events. So definitely subscribe so you don't miss that. I'm Amber Melanie Smith, and I'll see you next week. Bye.